Hey CARBO Brotherhood, this is Mark with CARBO. Today we're going to go over how to install the CARBO trigger spring kit for the Kimber Micro 9. The tools needed for this spring kit installation is going to be a bench block, a 1/16 punch and a 1/8 punch, a 3/32 Allen key, your hammer, and a pair of needle nose pliers. Check the chamber, magazine well, and the breech face. So we have a clear firearm here. Take a couple stock trigger pulls first, and I've got my Lyman pull gauge here. Since this is a curved trigger, we're going to pull from the center of the trigger and parallel with the barrel. We got 5 pounds 3 ounces, 5 pounds 8.7 ounces, 5 pounds 12.7 ounces, 5 pounds 12.7 ounces again, 5 pounds 13.5 ounces for an average of 5 pounds 10.2 ounces. So what we're going to do first is we're going to pull back the slide just enough to match up the takedown lever with this little groove inside here, and then push the takedown lever out from the bottom side and pull it straight out. So now we can remove the slide. So now that we have the slide off, we'll remove the factory firing pin spring. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 1/8 punch here. So we're going to push down on the firing pin here and then use the punch to push out the firing pin stop. And then you want to put your thumb over the top here when you do remove it, because the firing pin's under spring tension, so it's going to want to fly out there. So now we can remove the firing pin and the firing pin spring, set that to the side, and grab our lighter firing pin spring from our CARBO kit. Put that in, slide the firing pin and spring back in the firing pin channel, and then you got to be careful with the extractor here. It's going to want to fall down a little bit. So we're going to take our firing pin stop here and start it inside the grooves there. And then if your extractor did slide down a little bit and stopping it from pushing that firing pin stop in, use a 1/16 punch here and just try to grab that groove under there so that you can fit it right under. So now the only thing that's stopping it is the firing pin. And then I use a 1/8 punch for this to just push it down, just like that. And then as you're pushing down, you can slide the firing pin stop back in. So now we have the firing pin spring installed. We'll set that slide to the side and grab our frame. So what we're going to do first is put your finger on the hammer here and pull the trigger so that you slowly release the hammer a little bit. And we're going to take our 3/32 Allen key here and remove these screws on the grips. And your firearm's also going to have O-rings in here between the screws and the grip panels. Keep them to the side over here. Don't lose those. So now that we have the grip panel off, we can take our bench block and then go ahead and move this pin here, holding in the mainspring housing. And then we can slide the mainspring housing out, and we can install our lighter hammer spring here. So there's a little pin right here that we're going to want to punch out. That's what's holding the hammer spring in place. So we're going to use our 1/8 punch, push down on it as we take our 1/16 punch to push out the pin gently, just like that. So now we can remove the hammer spring, set that to the side with our firing pin spring. So now we're going to take our lighter CARBO hammer spring here and put in the retention pins here. We're going to make sure that the one that's pointed like kind of like an arrow goes in the bottom of the mainspring housing here, and then the flat one with a little bit of a dimple inside goes on top. So you can see how that bottom retaining pin is kind of poking out there through the hole. That's to keep tension on this pin here that locks it in place so that it doesn't slide out. All right, so now that we have the lighter hammer spring in, we're going to, same thing as disassembling it. Make sure you have your hammer spring retaining pin ready to go. So we're going to push down with a 1/8 punch and then take your pin and put it through the hole just like that. And you're going to make sure that you're putting it through the flat side first, so that the pin's flush with the face here. So now we can set that to the side and go ahead to dive in to remove the Sear spring here. So first we'll slide our safety switch up and wiggle that out. It's going to have a little groove right here that matches up with this cut inside here. So you're going to do that. It's right around 90 degrees about, so you can slide that right out. We're going to remove the safety plunger and safety plunger spring, set that to the side. From the other side, tap out the hammer pin here. Let that slide out so we can remove the hammer now. We're going to keep that all in the same spot so we don't lose it. Next, we're going to remove the Sear pin here. If yours is loose enough, you can kind of just tap it out, get it started, and pull that out, and then your Sear and extractor is going to fall right out, and then you can take out the Sear spring. If your Sear pin's a little bit tighter, you can take off this grip panel here and then just push it out with the pin. So now that we got the Sear and ejector out and the Sear spring, we're gonna take our lighter CARBO Sear spring. You can see here too that the geometry is a little bit different for the new CARBO Sear spring to the OEM, that the leg is a little bit shorter on this side. This is so that it contacts the Sear at a lower point on it, giving it a little more torque because if it's a lighter spring. We want to make sure that it has enough torque on the Sear here to push it back to catch the hammer every time. So now that we got the Sear spring ready to be installed, first thing I want to do is make sure that these legs are both like nice and even with each other. With the heat treating process during these springs, they sometimes want to warp because they're so thin. So they can either warp this way or warp that way. We want to make sure that these legs are both parallel with each other and nice and even, which they are. And then what you're going to want to do also is make sure that it's slightly curved back to the back side. So if you have the bend at the bottom here facing to your left, you want to make sure that these legs kind of bend just slightly backwards. And if they don't, kind of just use your fingers to kind of just push them back just barely. Don't bend too much or else they can permanently deform, but just kind of take each leg by himself like that and bend them back so that you get a nice, even, smooth bend to the back. So bending these legs back will also in turn reduce the amount of deflection of the Sear spring inside the firearm, so I'll give you a lighter trigger pull. If you do install this kit and you have a slightly heavier trigger pull than you anticipated for, just give these legs a little bit of a bend to the backside and that'll lighten up the trigger pull for you. We're gonna feed it through the bottom here, put it behind the trigger bar, and then have that bottom bend catch inside that little slotted cut. And to keep it retained, we're going to take our mainspring housing and just slide it in. So if your firearm is a little dirty too, while we have everything apart, you can go ahead and just clean off any of residual carbon. Take some CLP, clean it up a little. Make sure that it's got some oil on it. Go ahead and do the same thing with the ejector. And we're going to take our ejector here, using our thumb to push up on the trigger bar here because we want to keep that in place. We're going to wedge the ejector in between the Sear spring and the trigger bar. And take our Sear pin here, kind of line up the holes so that it'll go right through. So now that we've got the ejector located in place with the pin through it, we're going to prop up the gun just like this, and if your gun falls forward, a little easier to prop it up with a bench block just like this. Now we're going to take our Sear and we're going to make sure that this top side, this long top side, is pointed to the back, and that this little bend here bends to the front just like that. We're going to use pliers to grab it just like that because our fingers a little small to get in between those holes here. And then we're going to do the same thing as the ejector and try to wedge it in between the Sear spring and the trigger bar. We're going to take a 1/8 punch and kind of push back on both those legs so that we can slide it in between right in place. Now that the Sear is wedged in between the Sear spring and the trigger bar, use our pliers again here to grab the top and just wiggle it back or angle it back so that the holes line up and you can push that Sear pin right through. And a good check, we want to make sure that that shoulder leg isn't in front of the Sear and pushing up only against the trigger bar. We want to make sure that both legs are behind the Sear and the ejector so that we know that we have proper installation. So now we got the Sear spring, Sear, and ejector installed properly. We're going to take our hammer and we're going to slide that hammer strut down behind the Sear spring there so that it's pushing up against the mainspring housing here. The reason we didn't put that pin in yet to lock in the mainspring housing is because we need to slide this down a little bit to give the hammer some room so that we can line up the holes. And then we're going to take our hammer pin, slide that right in, pull the trigger on it to release the hammer and push it up so that we can slide the mainspring housing in place. Now we're going to use our hammer to punch that pin back in, just like that. Now we're going to take our safety switch, slide that in facing in 90 degrees to let it fall in that little cut. Take our safety plunger and spring, set that inside the trigger pin hole. Use a 1/8 punch. I would not recommend using a 1/16 punch for this. It's like get a bigger face to push down on the safety plunger here, and then rotate the safety right over it. You want to make sure you do that very carefully or else that spring can come flying out and it's a very small piece, you can easily lose it. Now we're going to take our grip panel again, slide that right over. Make sure you put your O-rings on. This gun doesn't have any O-rings because we've taken apart this gun hundreds of times to where they've just been destroyed. So we're going to take our screws and screw that in nice and tight. The reason for the O-rings is because it gives it that tension pushing up on the screws so that they lock in place. Without the O-rings, when you're firing, these screws will just come loose, and then your grip panels will come loose, and it's a pain in the butt. So now we're gonna reattach the slide. It's easier if you pull the hammer back a little bit for right now, and then push, make sure that the guide rod here has clearance from the frame. And then once you get to this position, we're gonna push down on the ejector to slide over. So we're gonna use a 1/8 punch, kind of just push it down and slide the slide right over. Now that we got to here, we're gonna line up the holes for the takedown lever, slide that in, and then pull the slide back a little bit so that the notch matches up with the takedown lever. Now your gun is completely installed with the CARBO Micro 9 trigger spring kit. So now we're gonna do some trigger pulls with the spring kit installed. We're gonna make sure that our gun is clear. Take our pull gauge, pull it the same just like we did with stock. So we got 4 pounds, 0.0 ounces. 3 pounds, 13.4 ounces. 4 pounds, 4.8 ounces. 4 pounds, 2.6 ounces. 4 pounds, 1.6 ounces. 3 pounds, 14.5 ounces, for an average of 4 pounds, 0.9 ounces. So right on 4 pounds. And again, if you're having trouble with the heavier trigger pulls, just bend back those Sear springs a little bit, and you'll get a nice, good reduction that you need. Thanks for watching. If you're having trouble, feel free to give us a call or send us an email. Also be sure to check out our new support site at support.mcarbo.com.